The room was so still you could hear the clock tick behind the lawyer's desk. No one breathed when he said it. This part is strange. Every head turned toward me, eyes sharp with curiosity and something colder underneath. My daughter-in-law Vanessa let out a soft, mocking laugh and whispered, "Probably nothing." But when the lawyer read my name once, then twice, then a third time, the laughter caught in her throat. That was the moment I realized my husband wasn't done teaching this family lessons, even from the grave. My name is Evelyn Carter, and for 64 years I've learned that silence can be both a shield and a weapon. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, daughter of a schoolteacher and a pastor who believed dignity was a woman's best armor. I taught English for 37 years, raised one son, and stood by my husband through sickness, loss, and success. And yet, on the day of his will reading, I sat at the end of a long mahogany table, like a stranger in my own story. They all thought they knew how this would go. Charles's brother, all puffed up pride and cologne, sitting beside his wife who'd already picked out which vacation house she wanted. My son David, handsome, nervous, couldn't look at me for long. And then there was her, Vanessa, his wife, sitting front and center, a smile so wide it could split glass. That woman walked into my life 15 years ago with perfume that could choke a saint and the kind of charm that made weak men mistake manipulation for love. She never liked me, not really, too old-fashioned, too proper. The kind of woman she couldn't outshine because I had nothing to prove. Still, for Charles's sake, I bit my tongue more times than I can count. When my husband, Charles Carter, passed away, he left behind more than property and stocks. He left a family already cracking beneath the weight of greed. And if I'm being honest, I knew what was coming. I knew the moment Vanessa insisted on handling the arrangements, the moment she pushed me out of decisions like I was some irrelevant widow with fading memory. But here's what they didn't know. Charles and I had built our life brick by brick, through years of struggle that no luxury-hungry woman could ever understand. And before he took his last breath, he promised me something. "Evie," he whispered, "I'll make sure you have peace, even if I have to reach back from heaven to give it to you." I didn't understand what he meant back then, but sitting in that office watching the lawyer's hand tremble as he unfolded the last page, I finally did. The lawyer, Mr. Milton Green, cleared his throat again. His voice quivered just enough to make Vanessa glance up from her phone. "To my beloved wife, Evelyn Carter," he began. The words echoed through that room like the opening notes of a hymn, soft but impossible to ignore. I felt my pulse steady. I didn't flinch, didn't smile. I'd been underestimated too long to show my hand now. Vanessa leaned toward David, whispering something about formality and just the pleasantries. But even she must have noticed how Milton's eyes flicked toward me before he continued, because deep down she could sense it. Whatever Charles had done, whatever he'd written, it wasn't going to favor her. I folded my hands in my lap, thinking of the years behind me, the long evenings teaching high school kids about truth and irony, the nights I sat by Charles's hospital bed, holding his hand while his breathing grew shallow, the quiet prayers I whispered over his pillow when I knew the end was near. And now, here I was, surrounded by people waiting for me to crumble. But they were about to learn something I'd always known. You can't humiliate a woman who already learned how to survive in silence. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat once more, and said the words that made the room freeze. "This part," he said slowly, eyes on me, "is very specific. Your husband wanted it read exactly as written." Then he unfolded the final page, the one marked in Charles's handwriting, and as his voice began to tremble over the words, I saw Vanessa's smirk fade into something else, something close to fear. He read my name once, then twice, then a third time, and by the time he reached the last line, The woman who thought she'd won everything couldn't even stay on her feet. When people talk about marriage, they love to mention the vows, for better or worse in sickness and in health. But they rarely mention the quiet years in between, the ordinary days that test who you really are. Charles and I had plenty of those. We met in the summer of 1978, two college kids from different sides of Georgia who found common ground in ambition. He wanted to build something that would last. I wanted to build someone worth remembering. And for 42 years, we did both. We raised one son, paid off every debt we ever made, and turned a modest construction business into a real estate firm with our name on every sign. But the older we got, the more I noticed the world changing around us. Louder, faster, colder. And somewhere in all that noise, our son David lost himself to it. When Vanessa came along, I tried to see what he saw. She was young, beautiful, confident, and clever enough to charm a dying man's smile out of Charles. But behind that charm was something slick, something too polished to be sincere. From the beginning, she treated me like I was part of the furniture that came with the family name, a relic from another time. She'd come into my kitchen wearing her designer heels, wrinkle her nose at the smell of cornbread, and say things like, "Oh, Evelyn, you still cook like you're back in the 70s. I'd smile and remind her that Charles liked my cooking just fine, but she'd just laugh that delicate fake laugh of hers, the kind that always made my skin tighten. As Charles's health began to slip, Vanessa's presence grew. She was there for every doctor's appointment, every medication schedule, every decision about the business. At first, I was grateful for the help, but help has a way of turning into control when you're not looking. Soon she was answering Charles's phone calls, deciding who could visit, and keeping the mail locked away, so things wouldn't get lost. I'd ask to see him alone, and she'd smile and say, "Of course, Evelyn," before hovering in the doorway, pretending she had something to clean. David said I was being dramatic. "She's just trying to make things easier, Mom," he'd say, his eyes glued to his phone. He didn't see how Vanessa spoke for him, too, how she made their home a stage, with him as the background and her as the star. I started noticing little things disappearing. Charles's watch, a few old family photos, a folder of company papers. When I'd ask, Vanessa would wave her hand and say, "I put them somewhere safe." But Charles saw it. He always saw more than he let on. Some nights, when she was out at one of her fundraisers, he'd reach for my hand and whisper, "Don't worry, Evie, I know what she's doing." He'd smile faintly, the same way he used to when he was planning something he didn't want me to know yet. I'd brush his hair back and tell him to rest, thinking he was just trying to comfort me. But looking back, those nights were when he was making his plans. It got worse after Thanksgiving. Vanessa told the family that Charles's memory was slipping, that he'd started forgetting names. I knew it was a lie. His mind was still sharp as a tack. But David believed her. Suddenly, she was handling the bank accounts, the company payroll, even the mail addressed to me. I tried to fight it quietly, but every move I made was met with a smile and a phrase that could freeze water. "You really should relax, Evelyn. You're not as young as you used to be." I'd go home, sit on the edge of my bed, and talk to Charles's photograph like he was still there. "They're circling, baby," I'd whisper. "You built this whole thing, and they're already picking at the bones." I started keeping a small journal, notes about dates, names, things I saw and couldn't prove. It wasn't anger that made me write. It was instinct. I knew Vanessa would twist every word I said if the time ever came. And then one night, I found it. A letter sitting on my nightstand, sealed with red wax, my name written in Charles's handwriting. I remember staring at it for a long time, tracing the familiar loops of his E's and C's, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I didn't open it right away. I tucked it inside my Bible, between Psalms and Proverbs, and told myself I'd wait until I needed it most. I didn't know it then, but that letter was the beginning of everything that came next. the silence, the schemes, and the moment in that lawyer's office when Charles's final words would rise from the grave and turn their laughter into fear. The months after that letter appeared were the loneliest of my life. Charles's illness deepened, and the house that once echoed with laughter and gospel music turned quiet, except for the soft hum of machines and the shuffle of nurses' shoes. I stopped teaching that winter, too afraid to be away for long. My days revolved around medication schedules, doctor calls, and the sound of his weak but steady breathing in the next room. But even in that silence, I could feel Vanessa's presence. Not in the room, but in every decision, every phone call, every stranger who suddenly needed my husband's signature. She began coming to the house more often than David. Every time I saw her car pull up the driveway, something in my chest tightened. She'd sweep into the living room like she owned the air, all perfume and pity. "You need rest, Evelyn," she'd coo. "Charles gets agitated when you hover." I wanted to ask her what she knew about agitation, about watching the man who built your whole life start to fade in front of you, but I didn't. I just smiled. The same tired smile women like me learn early in life, and said, "I've managed fine this long." Charles started to notice, too. One night, while Vanessa busied herself in the kitchen pretending to make tea, he whispered, "She's moving too fast, Evie." His voice was barely a breath. I leaned in close, and he squeezed my hand weakly. "Don't trust what she says about the business. She's been asking questions she shouldn't." His eyes, those same steady brown eyes that used to hold whole conversations without a word, looked almost fearful. I wanted to ask what he meant, but his cough took over before he could finish. Later that week, I found an opened envelope on the counter. Inside were property documents. One of our commercial buildings transferred into David's name, signed by Charles but dated 2 days earlier. Only I knew he'd been asleep almost all that time. When I confronted Vanessa, she laughed it off. "He must have signed them earlier," she said, her smile stretched thin. "You know how forgetful he's been." I didn't argue. I knew it would only make things worse. David stopped visiting alone after that. If he came, Vanessa was glued to his side like a shadow. She'd feed him lines. "Your mother's overreacting. Your father's getting confused. We're just trying to help." And he believed her, not because he didn't love me, but because it was easier. It's always easier to trust the person who offers comfort over the one who brings truth. By Christmas, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. Vanessa had redecorated. Charles's office, to make it brighter, boxed up his old files and replaced his photographs with generic art prints. The portrait of our wedding day, the one where I wore my mother's veil, was missing from the hallway. When I asked, she tilted her head and said, "Oh, that old thing? I thought it was taking up space." That night, I sat in Charles's old recliner and cried for the first time in months. Not loud sobs, just the kind of quiet tears that come from exhaustion. I felt him slipping further away, not just in body, but in legacy. Everything he'd worked for, every brick, every acre, every saved dollar, was being rewritten in someone else's handwriting. Then, 2 nights before New Year's, I woke to find Charles awake, sitting up in bed. The lamp cast a soft gold light over his face, pale but calm. "Evie," he said, his voice clearer than it had been in weeks. "You still have that key I gave you?" "The old brass one?" I asked. "The one from your office drawer?" He nodded slowly. "Keep it safe. When the time comes, you'll know." I wanted to ask what it opened, but something in his eyes told me not to. He leaned back against the pillows, his breathing shallow again. "I know what they're doing," he murmured. "I've set things right, but you'll have to let them laugh first." "Let them laugh?" I repeated, not understanding. He smiled faintly, the ghost of his old self flickering across his face. "They'll think they've won, but when the truth comes, Evie, the noise will stop." The next morning, he didn't wake up. David and Vanessa arrived hours later, both dressed too neatly for people who claimed to have rushed. Vanessa pressed her cold hands over mine, fake tears glistening in her eyes. "He's at peace now," she said softly. "We'll handle everything." And she did. The funeral, the calls, the finances. I wasn't even allowed to choose the hymn for his service. When I asked to read one of his poems, something he'd written for me years ago, she said, "Maybe something lighter, Evelyn. This isn't about you." I watched her talk to the lawyer afterward, smiling that polished smile of hers, and I remembered Charles's last words, "You'll know when the time comes." I didn't yet, but I had that brass key tucked in the pocket of my purse, warm from my hand, and somewhere deep in my chest, the faintest spark of patience. Something told me that whatever she thought she was taking, Charles had already planned to take back. The morning of the funeral, Savannah felt colder than I'd ever known it. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with rain that refused to fall. The church was full, but it didn't feel like home. People came dressed in dark coats and careful expressions, whispering about business deals and memories they'd only half lived. The smell of lilies filled the air, too sweet and too strong, masking the truth that most of them weren't here for Charles. They were here to be seen. Vanessa stood at the front like she'd been cast in a play, her black dress hugging her too tightly, her hands clutching pearls like a prop. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief that never seemed to get wet. David sat beside her, his face drawn, his grief buried under confusion and pride. When the pastor spoke about a man of honor and vision, I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. It wasn't just for Charles. It was for everything he built that these people would never understand. After the service, Vanessa took charge like she always did. She positioned herself near the casket, greeting mourners like a hostess at a cocktail party. I stood back, letting them come to me if they wanted to. A few old friends from the neighborhood hugged me tight, their faces kind but tired. Others just nodded, whispering, "He was a good man." Then came Milton Green, Charles's lawyer, tall, polite, with a face that looked like it had been carved from patience itself. He waited until the last guest drifted away before approaching me. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "Charles left specific instructions for his will. There are a few matters that need your attention, but not today." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax and marked in my husband's handwriting. "Charles wanted you to have this privately," Milton continued. "He said you'd know when to open it." I took it carefully, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. The wax was stamped with the same symbol that had been on the brass key, the number 42, looped elegantly. My throat tightened. "Did he tell you what it meant?" I asked. Milton gave a small, knowing smile. He said it would make sense when the time was right. I thanked him, slipped the envelope into my purse beside the key, and watched as he disappeared into the drizzle outside. Vanessa noticed, of course. Her eyes followed every movement sharp as a hawk. She sidled up to me, voice honeyed but sharp underneath. "Was that about the will?" she asked, feigning casual curiosity. "Just condolences," I replied, meeting her gaze. She smiled, a smile too thin to be polite. "Good. I hope he didn't leave you too much paperwork to deal with. You've been under such strain." She patted my hand like she was soothing a child. "David and I will take care of everything from here on out." I didn't answer her. Instead, I turned and looked at Charles's casket one last time. The brass handles gleamed under the church lights, and for a moment I imagined him laughing softly at her performance. He always said, "Vanessa could turn an empty room into a stage if you let her." Outside, the rain finally began to fall. A slow, steady rhythm that soaked into the earth like a blessing and a warning. I stood beneath my umbrella and whispered, "You said I'd know when, Charles. I'm waiting." The weeks that followed were a blur of signatures and silences. Vanessa handled the phone calls to the bank, the lawyers, and the company board. Every time I asked for updates, she'd smile that smooth, professional smile. "Everything's in motion, Evelyn. You just rest." Rest. That word tasted bitter. I'd spent my whole life working, teaching, raising a son, supporting a husband's dream. And now I was being told to rest, as if I were a piece of furniture finally retired from use. I watched her host luncheons in my dining room, her laughter spilling through the halls like cheap perfume, while I sat on the porch pretending not to hear. She'd tell guests, "Charles trusted me with everything," as if I'd never been part of that trust. Then one morning, a thick white envelope arrived in the mail, stamped with Milton Green's firm name. It was the official notice for the will reading, scheduled for the following Friday at 10 a.m. sharp. Vanessa found me in the kitchen reading it. "Oh, good," she said, grinning as she poured herself coffee from the pot I'd just brewed. "Finally, we can close this chapter and move forward." "We?" I asked quietly. She sipped her coffee, meeting my eyes over the rim. "Of course. Charles wanted what's best for his family, and that means David and me. Don't worry, Evelyn, I'm sure he left you something sentimental." She set the cup down and flashed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe the garden bench you love so much." That evening, when the house was quiet, I sat on that same garden bench under the magnolia tree Charles planted our first year of marriage. I held the brass key in one hand and the unopened letter in the other. The moonlight caught the wax seal, making it glow faintly red. My fingers itched to break it open, but I could almost hear Charles's voice again. "You'll know when the time comes." So I waited, and as the night breeze rustled the leaves above me, I whispered into the dark, "Let them laugh, baby. I'll wait as long as it takes for the noise to stop." By Friday morning, my black dress was pressed, my pearls clasped, and my hands steady. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Older, yes, but not weaker. The same woman who'd built a life from scratch was still standing. When I walked into Milton Green's office that morning, the whole room turned. Vanessa smirked. David avoided my gaze. The others shifted in their seats, already hungry for what they believed was theirs. But I had my letter, my key, and something they'd never understand: patience born from pain. And before that day was over, Charles's final lesson would begin. Milton Green's office was a study in quiet power. Mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers, a grandfather clock ticking faintly in the corner, and the soft hum of an air vent that couldn't quite hide the sound of people's anticipation. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the windows streaked with silver. I could smell the faint trace of cigar smoke on the air, the kind Charles used to enjoy after long meetings. For a moment, I could almost feel him there, sitting in the corner, watching. Vanessa sat front and center, like a woman waiting for her coronation. She'd chosen her outfit carefully: a black fitted dress, her hair in a perfect twist, diamond studs catching the light every time she turned her head. David sat beside her, eyes darting between me and Milton, his knee bouncing under the table. Charles's younger brother, Leonard, had taken the seat nearest the lawyer, puffing out his chest as if he were next in line to some invisible throne. I took the seat furthest from them all, near the window. I preferred the distance. From there, I could see everyone clearly. The way Vanessa whispered to David, the way Leonard smirked, the way greed settled over them like a fine mist. Milton adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. "We're gathered today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Charles Henry Carter," he said, his tone smooth, practiced, but respectful. "I want to begin by saying your husband was thorough. There are several sections, each with specific instructions." Vanessa smiled like she already knew what those instructions were. She rested one manicured hand on David's arm and whispered, "Just relax." He didn't answer. Milton unfolded the first page. "To my beloved son, David Carter, I leave the management rights to Carter Realty under the condition that he maintains the company's founding principles of integrity and fairness." Vanessa squeezed his arm proudly. I watched her lips curl just slightly, a serpent smile hidden behind sympathy. Milton continued, "To my nephew, Leonard Carter, I leave the proceeds from the sale of our warehouse property on Jefferson Avenue as a token of gratitude for his years of service." Leonard puffed up, pretending to look modest, but his eyes gleamed. The others received their share: stocks, small properties, personal mementos. Each name brought another round of polite thank yous, each pause another burst of whispered greed. No one looked at me, not once. Finally, Milton turned the page and paused. The clock ticked. Outside, a car honked faintly in the distance. He took a deep breath and said, "Now, there remains one final section, handwritten by Mr. Carter himself. He instructed that it be read last." Vanessa let out a soft, dismissive laugh. "Oh, that must be the sentimental part. Charles always liked to end things on a sweet note." Milton's eyes flicked toward her, unamused. "I would ask that everyone remains silent while I read this portion. It contains very specific language." The air shifted. The laughter died. Vanessa's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Milton unfolded a separate, smaller sheet of paper. The edges slightly yellowed, Charles's handwriting slanting across it in the way I knew so well. He hesitated, as though choosing his next words carefully. "To my beloved wife, Evelyn Carter," he began, "for reasons known only to her and me, I leave the Carter estate, the home where we built our life together, the land on which it stands, and every key that opens a door upon it." A murmur rippled through the room. Vanessa blinked, her smile frozen. Leonard frowned. David looked from the lawyer to me, confusion spreading across his face. Milton continued, his voice steady. "To my wife, Evelyn Carter, for her patience, her silence, and her strength, I leave ownership of the downtown properties on Madison and 3rd. May she use them as she sees fit, free of interference." This time there were no murmurs, just stunned quiet. Milton glanced up, eyes meeting mine briefly before he spoke again. "And finally," he said slowly, "to my wife, Evelyn Carter, and to the heirs she deems worthy, I leave full authority over Carter Holdings and all remaining assets. No changes to this clause may be made without her written consent." I heard Vanessa inhale sharply, the sound like a gasp and a choke rolled into one. "That's ridiculous," she blurted. "That must be a mistake. Charles wouldn't—" Milton raised a hand, calm but firm. "There's more." He unfolded another page, this one sealed with the same red wax as my envelope. "This section," he said, "was not typed. It was signed and notarized by Mr. Carter himself 3 months prior to his passing. He called it the clarification." Vanessa gave a short, nervous laugh. "The what?" Milton read on. "This is the part where things become unusual," he said softly. Then, in Charles's own words, "My wife's name shall be read 3 times, so there can be no doubt about her rightful place in this legacy. Once for the years she stood by me when I had nothing, twice for the patience she showed while others schemed, and a 3rd time for the justice she deserves when I am gone." The air left the room all at once. Milton folded the page and looked up. Vanessa's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, her lips parted but wordless. Leonard stared at the floor. David's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water that wasn't there. I didn't speak. I simply sat there, my fingers resting on my lap, feeling the weight of Charles's promise settle around me like armor. Milton cleared his throat again, his voice lower now. "There is one final instruction, Mrs. Carter. One that Mr. Carter insisted I deliver personally." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was the brass key, the same one Charles had told me to keep safe. "He said you'd know what to do with this when the time came." The faintest smile crossed my lips. "I do," I said quietly. Vanessa leaned forward, voice trembling. This isn't fair. There's no way this holds up legally. David, say something." But David didn't. He just stared at me. Really stared. For the first time in years, as though he was seeing the woman behind the silence. Milton closed the folder. "Mr. Carter's instructions are final," he said, standing. "There's also a letter addressed to you, Mrs. Carter. He requested it be read next." And just like that, the room that had felt so heavy a moment ago now pulsed with something else. Fear. Not mine. Theirs. Because they all realized finally that Charles had never left his empire in their hands. He'd left it in mine. Milton lifted the final envelope, red wax glinting in the light, and said softly, "This one was meant for your ears alone, Mrs. Carter." Milton's hands trembled slightly as he broke the red wax seal. The sound of the paper tearing was soft, almost reverent, like a church bell ringing for the last time. No one spoke. Vanessa sat frozen, her knuckles white against the armrest of her chair. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his breathing uneven. I kept my eyes on the window, the reflection of that letter glowing faintly against the glass. Milton adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. "To my wife, Evelyn Carter, the only person who ever saw me for who I was, not what I owned. If you are hearing this, then I am gone. But don't mistake my silence for absence. Even from beyond this life, I am still watching, still protecting what we built together." A sound escaped Vanessa, half laugh, half scoff. But it died quickly when Milton looked at her. He continued, "I have watched, quietly, as greed crept into the corners of our family, as those I trusted mistook kindness for weakness and silence for surrender. Evelyn, you never asked for anything. That's why I am giving you everything. You stood beside me when there was no business, no money, no name to be proud of, only the sweat of a dream and the faith of a good woman. You built this life with me, brick by brick, without ever demanding credit. You deserve to live the rest of your years in peace, without fear, and without having to beg anyone for permission to exist in your own home." Vanessa's face was tight now, her teeth clenched. "He was sick when he wrote that," she muttered, but her voice shook. Milton ignored her and kept reading. "To those who have taken advantage of my kindness, know this. Every false document, every forged signature, every theft disguised as help has already been accounted for. You will find copies of every transaction in a safe deposit box. The key, as Evelyn knows, is already in her possession." David shifted in his seat. "Dad, what does he mean? By forged signatures?" His question hung unanswered in the thick air. Milton's voice softened. "I've seen enough in my life to know that truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand. So I am standing one last time. For her. When you hear her name, know it is not habit or formality. It is justice." He paused and read the next lines carefully, each word deliberate. "To my wife, Evelyn Carter. For her grace under cruelty, I leave the deed to our estate and all accounts tied to it. To my wife, Evelyn Carter. For her faith in the face of disrespect, I leave controlling interest in Carter Holdings. And to my wife, Evelyn Carter. For her strength when others laughed, I leave the power to decide who remains family." The room fell silent. Even the ticking clock seemed to hold its breath. Milton folded the letter gently, his voice lowering. "Your husband signed this himself, Mrs. Carter. Dated and notarized. He was of sound mind when he wrote it." Vanessa's chair scraped sharply against the floor as she stood. "This is absurd. He was on medication. He didn't know what he was doing." Milton looked up, calm but firm. "Actually, Mrs. Carter, this letter was written 3 months before his passing. the same day he updated the company records to remove your name from the payroll and the family trust. The color drained from her face. "That's a lie," she shouted, but even David's eyes widened. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "what's he talking about?" She didn't answer. She sat down again hard, her breathing shallow. Milton turned to me and handed me the folded letter. "He asked that you keep this, Mrs. Carter, and that you read the last line yourself." I took the paper. The ink was faintly smudged, as if his hand had trembled near the end. My heart thudded as I read his final words aloud, my voice steady but low. "And to my beloved Evelyn, when they finally see you as I always did, remember, peace is not something they can take. It is something you choose." The words trembled in the air, filling every corner of that room. I folded the letter slowly, slipped it into my purse, and lifted my head. "Thank you, Milton," I said softly. He nodded once, respectful. "There's just one last note," he added. "Mr. Carter included a message for the rest of the family, a short one." He opened a smaller card and read aloud. "To everyone else, I suggest humility. It will hurt less that way." Vanessa's lips parted in disbelief. You can't just..." But Milton was already gathering the documents. "The meeting is adjourned," he said. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my dress, my pearl bracelet catching the light. Vanessa's voice rose behind me, sharp, trembling, desperate, but I didn't turn around. As I reached the door, I heard her whisper, "She won't keep it. I'll fight this." And maybe she would. But as my hand closed around the brass key in my purse, I realized something Charles had known all along. They could fight all they wanted. The truth was already mine. The shouting started before Milton even closed his briefcase. Vanessa's voice rose above the hum of the rain outside, trembling but loud enough to rattle the windows. "This isn't over. None of this is legal," she snapped, her chair screeching backward against the floor. "I'll have this will thrown out by Monday. You'll see. I'll take this to court if I have to." Milton didn't even look up. He'd seen this kind of storm before. Calmly, he tucked the papers into his leather case and said, "Mrs. Carter, you're welcome to pursue whatever legal avenues you wish, but I'd advise you to read the appendix before you do." "Appendix?" David asked, his voice uncertain. Milton handed him a smaller folder, thin but heavy with tension. "Your father was thorough. He anticipated reactions." David hesitated, then opened it. His eyes moved across the first page, and the blood drained from his face. "Vanessa," he murmured, "what is this?" She snatched the folder from him, flipping through the pages. The color in her cheeks deepened from pink to red. "That's private," she barked. "He had no right to..." Milton's calm voice cut through the air. "Your father had every right. Those are bank statements, Mrs. Carter. They document the transfers you initiated from the company account to your personal investment fund. It totals just over $97,000, unauthorized." Vanessa froze. Her eyes darted from Milton to David, then to me. "It was a mistake," she stammered. "A clerical error. He knew about it." Milton shook his head. Mr. Carter included notarized copies of his correspondence with the bank manager. He discovered it himself. David's voice cracked. "You told me that money was for Dad's medical bills." Vanessa turned to him, her words spilling out fast and frantic. "I was managing things for us, David. Your mother was too emotional and your father was too old to..." "Enough." The word left my mouth before I realized I'd said it. My voice wasn't raised, but it filled the room. For the first time in years, everyone stopped talking when I spoke. Vanessa stared at me, eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected sound to come from where silence once lived. "Excuse me," she managed. "I said enough," I repeated, standing slowly. "Charles knew exactly what you were doing. He didn't say anything because he wanted to see how far you'd go. And now, everyone else sees it too." David ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "Vanessa, Tell me it's not true. Tell me you didn't do this." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Only the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Milton cleared his throat. "There's also an audio recording," he said quietly. "Your father dictated it to me the same week he revised his will. He asked that I play it in the event of disagreement." Vanessa's head snapped up. "No, you can't." But Milton was already setting the small recorder on the table. He pressed play. Charles's voice filled the room. Weaker than I remembered, but steady. "If you're hearing this, then Evelyn has already been forced to sit through more arrogance than any woman should endure. Vanessa, I imagine you're protesting. You always do. David, I'm sorry you let yourself be blinded by charm when you should have been guided by character. But I raised you better than to mistake manipulation for love." David's head dropped into his hands. This business, this family, it wasn't built on entitlement. It was built on work, and no amount of lipstick on a lie will turn greed into grace. I've left the truth in the documents, in the bank records, and in Evelyn's hands. If she chooses to forgive you, count that as a blessing, because I wouldn't. Milton turned off the recorder. The silence that followed was heavier than grief. Vanessa pushed back from the table, her chair toppling behind her. "You're all fools," she hissed, her voice trembling. "He's not here to defend himself. He was sick. He didn't know what he was saying." "Your husband knew exactly what he was saying," Milton replied, and he ensured it would stand in court. He handed her another sheet. "This is a signed affidavit from 2 witnesses present when he recorded that message. Both verified his mental capacity at the time." Vanessa's breath came in short bursts. Her hands shook as she read the paper, her lips moving but no sound escaping. Then suddenly she swayed, one hand gripping the edge of the table, and with a small gasp, she fainted. The sound of her body hitting the floor made David jump to his feet. "Vanessa!" he cried, crouching beside her. But she was breathing, just unconscious. The shock too much for her pride to bear. Milton bent down and offered David a handkerchief. "She'll be fine," he said calmly. "Truth tends to have that effect on some people." I stood quietly, watching as the woman who had tried to erase me lay motionless at my feet. I didn't feel triumph, not yet, just a quiet release, like air escaping from a room that had been locked too long. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open, she looked at me, not with anger, but with something that almost resembled fear. "You'll regret this," she whispered hoarsely. I leaned down slightly, meeting her gaze. "I've regretted plenty in my life, Vanessa," I said softly, "but letting Charles have the last word won't be one of them." Milton snapped his briefcase shut. "That concludes the reading," he said, straightening. "Mrs. Carter, if you'd like. To arrange the next steps, my office will coordinate directly with you. The accounts and deeds will transfer by the end of the week." I nodded, calm, collected, steady. "Thank you, Mr. Green." David looked up at me from the floor, tears brimming in his eyes. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." I didn't answer him. Not yet. Some truths didn't need forgiveness right away. They needed time to breathe. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the polished glass of Milton's office door. Shoulders back, chin high, a woman who'd been buried beneath silence but never broken by it. Behind me, Vanessa's faint voice trembled again, almost to herself. He really left it all to her. I walked out into the hallway, the echo of my heels against the tile steady and certain. For the first time in years, the sound didn't carry weight. It carried peace. And in my purse, the brass key pressed warm against my palm, as if Charles himself had reached out to remind me. The noise had finally stopped. That night, the rain followed me home like an old friend. It drummed against the roof of the Carter estate. Our home for 40 years, and for the first time since Charles passed, the sound didn't make me ache. It was steady, comforting, almost protective. I hung my coat, kicked off my heels, and walked straight to the mantel where his photo rested beside a flickering candle. The letter lay open on the table, the ink beginning to fade where my fingers had touched it too many times. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat in his old recliner, and reached into my purse. The brass key felt warm, almost alive, its weight pressing into my palm like a heartbeat. Charles had told me I'd know when to use it, and I realized now, this was the moment he'd meant. Not when they mocked me, not when they laughed, but after the noise had ended, when the truth had already cleared the room. I slipped on my coat again and drove through the mist to the old downtown bank, where Charles had done business for decades. The night guard recognized me. He'd known Charles, too. "Evening, Mrs. Carter," he said, tipping his cap. "He told me once you'd come by someday." His words sent a chill through me, but not fear. Confirmation. Charles had planned every inch of this. Inside, the bank smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The security lights glowed dimly as the manager unlocked the vault and guided me down a narrow hallway. "Box number 42, he said, nodding. The same number engraved on the key. My hand didn't tremble as I slid it into the lock and turned. Inside was a small stack of envelopes, a flash drive, and a photograph. Charles and me on our wedding day, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing so hard our eyes were nearly closed. Beneath the photo was a note in his handwriting. "Play this first." I slipped the flash drive into the small viewing room computer. The screen flickered, and then there he was, my Charles, frail but smiling, his voice soft but clear. "Evie," he said, "if you're watching this, it means you've already done what I knew you would. Held your head high and let truth speak for itself. I told you I'd take care of you. I just needed time." He leaned closer to the camera, eyes full of that same calm confidence that had steadied me for 40 years. Vanessa thought she was clever. I let her. I wanted to see what kind of woman she really was when no one was watching. Every dollar she stole, every signature she forged, it's all documented here. The flash drive contains the full audit and copies of the transfers. I've also left copies with Milton, just in case anyone gets ambitious. He chuckled softly, the sound making my throat tighten. "I know you'd never ask for revenge, Evie. That's not who you are. You always believed people hang themselves with their own rope if you just give them time. Well, consider the knot tied. I just wanted to make sure you had peace, not vengeance. Peace." I reached out and touched the screen, his image blurring through my tears. He smiled faintly again. "One more thing," he said. "There's a second folder in the box labeled Legacy. That's for you to decide. I trust your judgment more than anyone's. Use it for good, my love. You've always known what matters." The video ended. The silence that followed was the most beautiful kind of quiet. Soft, full, final. I opened the second folder. Inside were signed deeds transferring several rental properties into my name, along with a note addressed in a familiar looping script, "For Evelyn Carter and the heirs she deems worthy." I laughed then, quietly but deeply. Charles had given me everything they tried to take: choice, control, dignity. When I returned home, the storm had stopped. The magnolia tree outside shimmered under the streetlight, heavy with raindrops like tiny pearls. I went to the kitchen, brewed another pot of tea, and opened my Bible to where I'd once hidden his first letter. Now there were two, one from before and one from after. I pressed them together and whispered, "You kept your promise, Charles. You gave me peace." As I looked around the house, the photos, the worn rug, the faint scent of cedar still lingering, I realized something I hadn't before. For years, I'd thought silence was something forced on me, but it wasn't. It was something I'd mastered. It was my weapon, my armor, and now my victory. The brass key still lay on the table beside my teacup, catching the soft light. I turned it slowly between my fingers, smiling. It wasn't just a key to a box. It was a key to the truth and to my freedom. Outside, dawn began to creep across the sky, washing the night in pale gold. And as the first light touched the edges of the Carter estate, I finally felt what Charles had meant all along. The fight was over. The noise was gone. And peace, real peace, had finally found me. The morning after I opened that deposit box, the sun rose clean and quiet over Savannah, painting the Carter estate in soft gold. For the first time in months, I woke without dread. No phones ringing, no whispers down the hallway. Just peace, the kind Charles promised me. I made myself coffee, buttered a slice of cornbread, and sat by the window watching the light spill through the magnolia tree. The world outside looked the same, but I wasn't. By noon, the phone started ringing. Reporters, board members, family, all wanting to know if the rumors were true. Someone had leaked the audit files. Milton later told me the documents were automatically sent to the firm's press contact, exactly as Charles had arranged. Every signature Vanessa forged, every unauthorized withdrawal. Public record now. Her name was on every headline in Savannah before dinner. David came by that afternoon. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders slumped, guilt hanging off him like a wet coat. He stood on the porch for a long moment before knocking. I let him. When I finally opened the door, his eyes were red. "Mom," he said, voice breaking, "I don't know what to say." I stepped aside and nodded toward the kitchen. "Start with the truth." He sat where his father used to sit, at the head of the table, hands folded tight. "She told me you were confused," he said quietly, "that you were making mistakes, that you were letting things slip. I thought she was helping." "She was helping herself," I replied, pouring him coffee. "You just didn't want to see it." He nodded, shame softening his face. "I know that now. I lost the company, my marriage." "You lost your integrity," I said gently. "Everything else can be rebuilt." For a long while, we just sat there. The ticking clock filled the silence between us. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "I know you are," I said, "but some apologies take time to settle." Outside, a car door slammed. Vanessa's voice pierced the quiet. "Evelyn!" David froze. She stood on the porch, hair disheveled, eyes swollen from crying. The same woman who once strutted through my home like she owned it now looked lost. "They froze my accounts," she said, voice trembling. "They're saying I could face charges." I met her gaze steadily. "You made your choices, Vanessa. Now you'll live with them." She stepped closer, desperation spilling out. "Please, you could fix this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." I shook my head. It wasn't. Tears streaked her makeup. "I never meant for it to go this far." "You meant every word, every signature, every lie," I said quietly, "and you laughed while doing it. You just didn't expect the echo." David stood and walked past her, heading for his car. "I can't do this," he muttered. "David, wait," she called, but he didn't turn back. When she realized I wasn't going to speak again, she whispered, "You'll regret this, old woman." I smiled faintly. "No, dear," I said. "I've already done my regretting." She left without another word. The gravel crunched beneath her heels, fading into silence. That night, I stood by the window again, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. I thought of Charles, of how quietly, methodically, he'd restored my dignity from beyond the grave. He hadn't left me vengeance. He'd left me balance. And as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. Spring came early that year. The magnolia bloomed before March, its petals soft as silk and heavy with scent. The town had already moved on to new gossip, but sometimes, when I walked downtown, I could feel the eyes still following me, a mix of awe, envy, and quiet respect. "That's Mrs. Carter," they'd whisper, "the woman who outsmarted them all." But it wasn't about outsmarting. It was about surviving. with grace intact. I spent those months turning the Carter legacy into something new. I donated one of the downtown buildings to a local women's literacy foundation. The others, I renovated into affordable housing, the kind of place I wished my students' mothers could have had when I was teaching. Milton helped with the legal work, though he kept shaking his head and saying, "Charles would have been proud," and a little astonished. Sometimes, in the evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and think of everything that had happened. The betrayal, the laughter, the fainting, the silence after. It all felt distant now, like another life. David visited often. Slowly we began rebuilding, not as a son trying to fix the past, but as a man learning what it meant to stand tall again. He helped with the foundation's events, met people outside the circle Vanessa had built around him. There was humility in his eyes now and something else. Understanding. One afternoon, as we packed boxes of donated books, he said softly, "Dad was right about you. You never had to shout to make yourself heard." I smiled, wiping the dust from my hands. He always did say the quiet ones changed the world. Later that evening, I found myself in Charles's study, the room now filled with sunlight instead of shadows. His photo sat on the desk beside the brass key, still gleaming faintly. I picked it up, turning it once more in my palm. "You kept your word, Charles," I whispered. "You gave me peace." A breeze slipped through the open window, lifting the curtains gently, almost like a nod. I smiled. Before going to bed, I wrote a short note and tucked it beside the 2 letters in. My Bible. It read, "When the time comes, let them read my name 3 times too. Once for the years I endured, twice for the strength I found, and a third for the peace I kept." The candle beside me flickered, its light warm against the page, and as I closed the book, I felt a calm so deep it reached my bones. The kind of calm that comes when a woman has finally reclaimed her story, and the world, at last, knows her name. By summer, the estate no longer felt like a museum of loss. The air smelled of lemon polish and new paint. Laughter from the volunteers drifted in from the courtyard as they sorted boxes for the Literacy Foundation. Each morning I walked the gardens Charles once tended and watched things bloom again. Grief had softened into gratitude. The papers called it the Carter will scandal for months, but scandals fade. What remained were the lessons, the kind that stick to a name longer than money ever can. Vanessa's trial lasted all of 1 day. The evidence Charles left was airtight. The judge called it a rare case of foresight. She left the courthouse with a suspended sentence and a public apology, though she couldn't bring herself to look at me when she read it. I didn't need her to. Some apologies aren't meant for the ears they hurt. They're meant for the soul that finally sees its own reflection. David stood beside me during the hearing. His hand trembled when the verdict was read. Later, outside on the courthouse steps, he whispered, "I don't know how you can forgive her." I looked at the sunlight glinting off the marble and said, "Forgiveness isn't for her, baby. It's for me. I can't carry her sins on my shoulders when the Lord already took them off mine." He nodded, eyes wet. Dad would have said the same thing. "Your father always believed justice didn't need to shout," I replied. "It just needed proof." That night, I lit a candle by Charles's photo and sat beside it until the wax pooled low. For the first time, I spoke aloud what I'd been holding in my heart for months. "You did good, Charles. You protected me in ways I didn't even know I needed. But now, it's my turn to protect what's left. Our name, our kindness, our peace." Outside, a summer storm rolled through, gentle and distant. I smiled. Charles always did love the rain. The day I finally closed the last of the estate accounts, the banker handed me a thin folder and said, "Mrs. Carter, everything's in order." Simple words, but they felt like a benediction. I walked out into the sunlight, the weight of decades lifting off my shoulders. Back home, I opened the windows and let the fresh air sweep through. The house was quiet. Not empty, not lonely, just still. the kind of stillness that holds gratitude. I brewed a pot of tea, the same brand Charles used to buy, and set 2 cups on the table out of habit. Old love lingers that way. It doesn't fade, it settles. Later that evening, I sat at my writing desk and began a letter, not to anyone living, but to whoever might one day need it. To the woman reading this, it began, "If they ever tell you you're too quiet, too old, too late, remember my story. Silence isn't weakness. It's the space where strength gathers its breath." When I finished, I tucked the note inside the same Bible that now held Charles's letters. I placed the brass key on top, tarnished but shining in places, and smiled. It had unlocked more than a deposit box. It had unlocked my freedom, my peace, my purpose. As dusk settled, I stepped onto the porch, watching the sky turn lavender. The world had gone on without its noise, without its cruelty, and so had I. Somewhere between the rustle of the magnolia leaves and the soft hum of crickets, I could almost hear Charles's voice again. "You see, Evie, peace always comes for those who wait." I closed my eyes and whispered back, "It did, love. It did." The candlelight inside flickered through the open door, dancing on the walls, a sign of life still warm within the home we built. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a widow or a victim. I felt whole. Because in the end, Charles's will wasn't about money at all. It was about legacy. Not the kind written on paper, but the kind written on the heart. And mine, finally, was free.